Today on BRStv Tank Trials ULM edition, it's episode 14 and we're talking ultra low maintenance, major, minor, and trace elements, and then giving away a $500 gift card at the end. I'm Ryan, your host of BRStv Tank Trials ULM edition. Tank Trials is all about taking everything the BRS team and reefing community knows about a very specific approach to reefing, implementing that knowledge, and then tracking the progress and exploring the results. This is episode 14 of ULM and development of an ultra low maintenance system. The goal is a show caliber, stable reef tank which requires as little maintenance as possible, potentially performing only a few minutes of maintenance a month. Today we're going to tackle one of the three most important components of healthy reef tank biology, stable chemistry. More specifically, ULM biology and stable chemistry solutions which allow us to spend some time and effort upfront to reduce demands on our time, long-term, and create the tank life balance that meets many individuals' family, work, travel, and general time needs. If we spend a bit of time getting stable chemistry, lighting, and filtration right, we'll almost certainly be capable of producing a show caliber, stable, and long-term successful reef tank that leans closer to a hobby than part of our weekend chore list. The chores can actually be part of the fun for many reefers, but that type of time commitment just isn't sustainable for a lot of people, and it doesn't have to be that way. Today we're going to attempt to challenge common thought on how to maintain stable ULM chemistry and important elements in the reef tank, more specifically an ultra low maintenance reef tank. That means taking a fresh or more modern look at the four primary methods of maintaining elements with water changes, two-part, Kalkwasser, and calcium reactors. There are absolutely some approaches to all of these that are often overlooked, and we can make this not just easier but more accurate and effective. So what is low maintenance in relation to today's topic? Well, first, it needs to fit our goal of only a few minutes of maintenance a month. To do that, it needs to be not just simple in setup, but more so in ongoing use and scaling with growth. Lastly, it needs to be reliable and safe during periods where you may not be able to check on the tank constantly. One note I'll say up front here is my own personal version of a ULM means I'm not hauling around buckets of salt water around and siphoning dirty water out of the tank with manual water changes. That's the most undesirable component of owning a tank for me, which means long-term, the tank's reliance on me performing them consistently is probably the biggest risk factor to the tank. I can say with 100% certainty that over a long enough timeline or many years, family, work, or general life will get in the way of me performing consistent water changes on these three tanks for some period of time, so I'd like to set them up in a way where their chemistry needs are not dependent on that. My confidence level that this can be done properly grows every week because the BRS 160 has been running with near zero water changes in the Triton system for some time now and never looked better. Chemistry is spot on, and we know this because of the ICP testing. Filtration is working with near zero nutrients and crystal clear water, and visually, the corals look great, so I'm hard-pressed to understand what a water change would be achieving here. We do perform them every few months when an element or something gets elevated, but in 8 or so months, I think that we've done 3 or 4 water changes, which is certainly meeting my ULM needs. That said, we already have the 160 running on Triton and we'll follow the results of that for at least the next couple of years. So even though that system is performing great, we're going to do something different with all 3 of the ULM tanks for this series. I think all of us want to explore other methods of achieving the same or similar results. So starting with the first option for maintaining major, minor, and trace elements, simple water changes which removes a portion of the element depleted water and replaces it with water with higher levels, effectively raising the levels back up. Using manual water changes to maintain major elements like calcium and alkalinity is not super popular because it's the most labor intensive and expensive method of maintaining these elements. That said, if you have a really low demand tank like our softy and polyps tank, where the largest source of depletion will just be the coralline algae, and the tank is reasonably small, a quick 5-gallon change may actually fit within our goal of a few minutes of maintenance a month. But the demand is going to have to be pretty darn low for this to be a realistic solution. Alternatively, you can set up automated water changes which absolutely fit our ULM needs. Mix up some salt water every month or two and automatically change out 3 to 5% of the water every day, which changes out a majority to almost all of the water with fresh seawater every month. This is almost certainly not just an effective solution for maintaining stable chemistry with the softy and polyp tank, but also many lower demand LPS tanks as well. In many ways, an automated water change system may be the lowest maintenance and most stable solution when matched to an appropriate low demand tank type, because it's pretty difficult to overdose anything when all you're doing is a daily dilution with typical seawater parameters. In this case, I'd say the only test that I even bothered performing would be alkalinity and salinity. If they're on, almost everything else is certainly spot on, or at least very close. With a DKH checker, refractometer, or even better, a digital refractometer, this is like a minute or two of testing tops. All this assumes you installed a properly designed and functioning water change system. There are a variety of fairly elaborate ways to do auto water changes, but the easiest is very likely with a simple but highly accurate dosing pump, which takes out and replaces a precise amount of water every day. The most popular almost certainly being the Neptune dose, which has easy to set up tasks designed around auto water changes with high quality, accurate stepper motors capable of doing this long term. If I were going to set up an auto water change, the Neptune dose is absolutely what I would use. For those of you that don't own an Apex, sadly most of the other aquarium pumps are just not built for this type of accuracy or duty cycles. Taking a quick look at the motors, it's easy to see why. So I think I'd look outside of the aquarium world and something more industrial, like a dual head pump from Stenner. But be prepared, industrial pumps with the types of duty cycles that we're looking for are pretty pricey. One thing I would note about the automated water change method is you want to use a salt mix which has the same or slightly higher levels than the desired levels in your tank. So using something like Instant Ocean, which has lower levels designed mostly around fish-only tank needs, is probably not the best option. The Reef crystals, which have higher levels, will produce results and sustainable element levels much closer to reefers' desires. Similar to that, Red Sea Blue Bucket, which is a BRS staff favorite here, is right at the levels most reefers are maintaining these days. Another favorite, HW Reefer, is just slightly higher and a good option for water change element replenishment, where consumption is slightly faster than the water changes keep up with. And lastly, the Red Sea Black Bucket, which maintains significantly elevated calcium and alkalinity for their Reef Foundation program, is probably one of the better options if your consumption is at the edge of what a typical automated water change schedule can maintain. Okay, moving on to likely the most popular option out there, two-part. When I say two-part, I mean in the general sense of the term, a component of calcium and alkalinity in separate jugs, most often designed to be dosed daily. However, they're often in 3 or even 4 parts now, which offer additional major, minor, and trace elements that go beyond calcium and alkalinity. Two-part additives are likely the most popular simply because it's the easiest to understand and implement. More or less, calcium and alkalinity levels drop, and you add equal amounts of each solution to raise them back up every day. Identifying how much to use is often as easy as testing today, testing tomorrow at the same time, and then using the Reef calculator to identify how much to use to raise them back up. That's now your daily dose. Then just adjust as needed as your corals grow or you add new ones. The popular two parts out there do have some differences, mostly related to how they approach trace elements, impact on the tank's pH, and of course cost. I will say that some of them are likely better suited for a ULM tank than others, particularly a ULM where one of the goals is to reduce the reliance on water changes, where water changes are an occasional tool used to treat a specific chemistry issue rather than a primary component of general system maintenance. There are two main issues with using two-part additives in a minimal water change system. First, how to handle the salinity increases, and second, trace elements. Starting with salinity, most of the two parts out there are based on chloride and sodium-based salts like calcium chloride, magnesium chloride, sodium carbonate, or sodium bicarbonate. While the tank will consume all of the calcium, magnesium, carbonate, and bicarbonate, the sodium and chloride will just build up and add salinity to the tank. Over the course of many months, the salinity in the tank will rise if left unchecked. Now, normally, any reasonable or standard water change schedule will account for this effect and maintain normal salinities, which is why this just isn't a concern for most reefers who are running two-part and have what most people would consider a normal water change schedule. So there is no way around it. If you dose two-part, which adds salinity, you will need to account for this and do some form of water change. The question is just frequency. So with something like our polyp and softy tank, the additions will likely be very small, so you could probably get away with a reasonable sized water change every few months or potentially even longer. With an LPS tank with medium consumption and resulting two-part additions, you probably should do a decent water change every month or so, which is only a dozen times a year. If you put some effort in to make water changes easy and fast, I think this could still be a ULM. With an SPS high consumption tank, I just don't think two-part is a good option. If you're also going to attempt to do very minimal water changes, the salinity will almost certainly become an issue. Keep in mind that this is only the case when water changes are very infrequent, which is not commonplace yet, and why you don't hear about this more often. Two-part additives are almost certainly the most common method of maintaining reef tank elements. There's one exception to the rule here, and that's Triton. Triton will also add salinity to the tank with its four-part major, minor, and trace element solution. However, they suggest that you simply run your skimmer wet to account for that. Basically, the skimmer removes a small amount of salt water every day, and your freshwater ATO will compensate to keep the salinity stable. If you don't run a skimmer or can't get it to run wet, just periodically remove some small amount of water and let your ATO replace it, which is essentially a small but easy type of water change. I asked if that eventually throws off the balance of all the elements and everything gets diluted to a small degree every day, and they shared that the four-part system is designed to account for that, and if an eventual imbalance does occur, that's where you'd use an infrequent water change as a tool to correct that. I was personally kind of skeptical, but I have to say in practice on the 160, it does seem to be working as intended. This might be true of other two-parts out there, but I don't think any of them can claim to do both exceptionally well. They either have to be formulated to be diluted with seawater water changes as part of general maintenance, or be formulated to be diluted with fresh water. To my knowledge, Triton is the only one that claims to be formulated specifically to be diluted with fresh water via skimming or manual removal and your ATO. The next issue is trace elements. No matter what your thoughts are on the importance of minor and trace elements on a general reef tank, it's wise to put more thought into it on a ULM that gets infrequent water changes. Again, this probably isn't a huge issue with a softy or polyp tank, but with LPS and SPS tanks, it can be a larger concern. If you use a standard two-part like BRS two-part, you're largely relying on water changes to replenish minor and trace elements. They'll very likely always be somewhat lower levels than natural seawater, but a decent water change schedule does a decent job of not letting them fall to the point that there are identifiable signs of stress in the tank. I think we've all seen a critical mass of long-term successful reef tanks that rely on calcium chloride, sodium carbonate, and water changes for other elements to dispute the type of successful reef tanks that this approach produces. That said, if you stop doing water changes, minor and trace elements, or really anything the tank naturally consumes but you don't replace, will fall further and further every month. In a low to medium consumption tank, even infrequent water changes will likely prevent them from falling to the point that the coral show visual signs of distress. But in a high demand tank, they'll very likely drop to the point that it causes issues. It's just a matter of how long it will take. Reefers place various degrees of importance on maintaining natural seawater, minor and trace element levels. I won't say that anyone is wrong in this debate because it's just a matter of time and effort versus results, and everyone will have a different value for this equation. Well, it's difficult to prove definitively or address with 100% accuracy which element produces what result and at what level. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence, and I think it's reasonable to assume there are almost certainly benefits associated with maintaining natural seawater, major, minor, and trace element levels that are likely going to show up in coloration, growth, tissue repair, and general metabolic health. Some of these benefits may be visually identifiable, and others will simply show up as a lack of issues, not really dissimilar from any organism or animal that lives in a nutritionally complete or nutritionally deficient environment. So there are a few common approaches to trace elements. First is two parts, which have many of the elements mixed in already, like Triton and ESV. This is certainly the most convenient. In most cases, true two parts are somewhat limited to what they can put into the bottle without precipitation, where the 3 and 4 parts generally address a wider range of elements. In an environment where you're doing maintenance water changes with a decent salt mix, I'm not sure if most reefers would see a huge difference in results between 2 and 4 parts, but in a minimal water change environments, I think there's some value in maintaining as many elements as possible. Since the Triton 4-part is designed specifically for this purpose, it's hard to ignore the value there, especially coupled with their ICP testing, which confirms it's working as intended. The other method is using separate trace elements designed to be used on their own. There's a whole slew of them out there, but I think in relation to today's ULM topic, there's really only one worth mentioning, and that's Red Sea's trace colors, which is trace elements that are kept completely separate from their two-part calcium alkalinity solution. There are a few reasons I like this option for a ULM. First, the 4-bottle solution has minimal issues with precipitation, so they can maintain a wealth of elements, and even though they're not included in the same bottle, the amount of the 4 elements you use is tied directly to how much calcium solution you use, which makes a lot of sense. And for those of you that are wondering, the Red Sea Trace Colors program is not just limited to their calcium and alkalinity solution. It can be used with BRS 2-part, do-it-yourself solutions, or really any system based on calcium chloride and sodium carbonate or bicarbonate, or even Kalkwasser. They include some pretty easy to do math to do this. Randy actually produced a spotlight recently which specifically outlines how to use Red Sea Trace Colors with BRS 2-part. Outside of that, every tank is different with different corals and different consumption of each element. So keeping everything separate like this allows us the flexibility to how they're dosed, which is really valuable with the ULM and minimal water changes. And to be frank, the trace colors in BRS 2-part is almost certainly the most cost-effective and relatively simple solution out there. Lastly, I'll note by not putting all of those elements directly in your 2-part, it makes it a ton easier to make larger, occasional adjustments to calcium and alkalinity without dosing a slew of unnecessary minor and trace elements. You might note that Triton directly addresses this and why they have their 4-part, but also calcium, alkalinity, and magnesium increasers, which are separate, so you can make larger, occasional changes without adding all those other elements in the 4-part. All in all, from a 2-part and trace element perspective, I think Triton, Red Sea, or BRS with Red Sea's trace colors is probably amongst the best options for a low water change environment. Moving on to Kalkwasser, I'm just going to come out and say it. Kalkwasser is one of the best solutions for a ULM, mainly because it does not add any sodium or chloride or salinity to the tank, which completely removes that concern. The only thing that Kalkwasser adds to the tank is calcium and alkalinity. In relation to minor and trace elements, there's also no reason why you can't use Red Sea's trace colors with Kalkwasser as well. Since the trace colors is tied to calcium consumption, all you need to do is identify how much calcium your tank consumes to figure out what the trace color dose is. Something that can be done manually every week or even put on a doser. Randy should also have a spotlight on how to use Kalkwasser with trace colors pretty soon, so make sure to pester him about it in those comments. I do have a few relevant notes on Kalkwasser and how it's used. It's most frequently used on an auto top-off, mixed to a specific strength between 1/8 of a teaspoon and max strength of 2 teaspoons of calc per gallon of fresh water in your ATO. It's a perfectly fine solution. However, that ties your calcium and alkalinity addition to the amount of evaporation your tank has, which can change pretty drastically seasonally. If you're not running fully saturated calc, it also requires you to clean your ATO reservoir completely between uses, so there isn't a buildup of calc at the bottom, making it more potent each time. Now, a lot of people don't concern themselves with either issue and do just fine, but with a ULM, I want to make it as stable and easy as possible. A much more consistent and scalable solution is to mix the Kalkwasser to maximum strength or saturation with 2 teaspoons per gallon of fresh water, and then dose a precise amount of that saturated calc solution daily. Meaning dose, say, 1,000 milliliters of saturated calc solution a day and let the ATO handle the rest of the evaporation needs on its own. Having a solution with a known consistent strength and then only adjusting how much you dose makes everything a lot easier and certainly more accurate. Very similar to 2-part, if the levels start to drop over time, simply up the dose from 1,000 to 1,100 milliliters. This is much more controlled. Allows you to dose at the time of day that you desire, not dependent on evaporation. Clean the container is less critical and much easier to scale accurately to your needs. If you're already dosing calc in your ATO, all you need is a second, often smaller reservoir and a dosing pump of some sort. For smaller tanks which only evaporate a gallon or so a day, the BRS 50 milliliter a minute ATO pump may work, but I would not use a 2-part 1.1 doser because it's way too slow. Really, I think almost any of the dosing pumps sold to the aquarium industry are probably accurate and reliable enough for this purpose, but you want something capable of spreading the dose out over a large portion of the day, something that the Neptune dose does almost automatically. I actually think that dosing the calc independently with a doser rather than based on your ATO is actually a safer way to dose calc because it's fairly rare for a dosing pump to get stuck on versus relying on an ATO, which is largely dependent on level sensors, which fail on and off fairly frequently. Okay, so on to the last option of calcium and alkalinity, calcium reactors. I'm going to go ahead and say this has the potential to be one of the best ULM options out there, but also one of the worst. Meaning if you set it up right, you may almost never need to touch it and ULM all the way. However, if you're inexperienced with them or attempt the most challenging approaches to tuning them, you may very well run into fairly frequent challenges and it will be a million miles from low maintenance. More or less, a calcium reactor just uses carbon dioxide to melt old coral skeleton or other sources of calcium carbonate to dose calcium and alkalinity to the tank, but in addition to that, it presumably adds many trace elements as well as it breaks down the old coral skeleton. It's hard to definitively say how true the claims are about trace elements in calcium reactor media or which ones are actually maintained, but it sounds very plausible that the old coral skeleton will contain a majority of what the coral needs to produce new skeleton. Probably not all, but it does seem very plausible that it will contain many. The main issue with calcium reactors is they have a few independent methods of controlling how it performs, all of which rely on each other and historically not dependable or stable, meaning you need to rely on a CO2 regulator to produce a reliable stream of CO2 bubbles. If it does slightly more or less, the concentration of the calcium and alkalinity added to the tank will change. To combat that, you can use a pH controller and solenoid to control the amount of CO2, but now you're relying on the pH probe to be accurate, which they normally are until they aren't. You're also dependent on how much water flows through the system, which is normally controlled with a needle valve, which is often accurate out of the box, but can get clogged and slow down fairly easily. Now, none of this is an issue if you enjoy tinkering with things, willing to put in the time to get everything right, and then have all the alarms and safety backups set up right. But I think this also doesn't have to be as complex as it sounds if you're willing to put in the effort to resolve some of the challenges. This is a high-level view, and there are a lot of ways to set up a calcium reactor, but you really have three options on how most people will approach setting up and tuning a calcium reactor. First, you can maintain a consistent effluent flow through the reactor so the same amount is being added to the tank, and then adjusting the pH or amount of CO2 to control the concentration of the calcium and alkalinity in the effluent being dosed to the tank. Alternatively, which is my preferred method, create a constant concentration of calcium and alkalinity inside the reactor by attempting to keep it around the maximum solubility, which seems to be about 35 DKH in the effluent when the reactor has an internal pH of 6.8. And then just adjust the flow rate of the reactor's effluent into the tank. If the concentration of calcium and alkalinity in the effluent is a constant, then adjusting the flow rate of the effluent dose to the tank is basically just adjusting the daily dose from, say, 20 to 25 liters a day. Or option 3, which is a combination of both and adjusting the concentration of the effluent and the flow rate at the same time. Many reefers may disagree, but I'd leave this to the calcium reactor pros because for newer reefers trying to adjust both concentration and the amount dosed, it just ends up more like playing mad scientist than producing consistent, reliable results. There's a distinct reason why option 2 of maintaining a saturated solution and controlling my dose is my preferred method. Is because this is based on a concentration of a constant max saturation, and having a constant to work off makes things a ton easier. In this case, if my solution is always 35 DKH inside the reactor, the only element that changes is the amount you dose to the tank. Let's say I dose 20 liters a day of fully saturated reactor effluent to the tank, but the levels start to drop because my corals are growing or I added a bunch of corals. Well, it's not really much different than two-part. I just up the dose from 20 to 22 or 23 liters a day. Most often by adjusting the needle valve, but it can also be done with something more accurate like a high-volume, continuous-duty dosing pump. I will say continuous-duty dosing pumps are not cheap and can make some noise. Your best bet is probably use Masterflex pump on eBay. The pump also doesn't necessarily need to run 24/7 either, so you could use something like a Neptune dose. At maximum flow rates, the dose does make some noise, but you could cut that down by using both dosing heads and halving the speed, but this is best used in an area where noise is not an issue. Potentially, you could also dose only at night when you're not around and noise isn't an issue. This would work particularly well if you could dose into a refugium, which can take up the excess CO2 at night. In any case, if you can maintain maximum saturation in the reactor, maintaining proper calcium and alkalinity and potentially trace elements is as simple as adjusting how much your reactor doses in a day. Really doesn't have to be that complex in the end because calcium and alkalinity are naturally balanced. It doesn't have salinity issues and presumably deals with trace elements as well. This might be easier than two-part. To make sure the effluent is saturated is two things. Make sure you get a reactor large enough for your tank, which can hold enough media and maintain proper contact time with the media. After that, I just start with a pH of 6.8, which at slower flow rates will produce a saturated solution of at around 35 DKH. At higher flow rates, you may need to drop down 1/10 of a point at a time between 6.7 and 6.4 to get the media to dissolve more rapidly. Careful not to go too low or the media will just melt. I will say that with this method, the constants are what makes it a lot easier, but also upgrading pieces of equipment that are most likely to cause issues is also valuable. There's real value in dumping the standard regulator and getting something more accurate like the carbon doser, which will regulate the amount of CO2 much easier and more accurately than other options. Outside of that, I'd also use a dual junction pH probe on the controller to maintain the proper pH in the reactor. Dual junctions adding accuracy, longevity, and length of time between calibrations, and it might even measure the pH of the effluent coming out of the reactor for redundancy. If a dosing pump isn't realistic for you, then I would use a solid, reliable pump or manifold to feed the reactor with a high-quality needle valve to set the flow rate. The Vertex calcium reactor actually comes with a needle valve as well as a flow rate meter, which is pretty handy. All in all, as long as you use an intelligent approach and you either know how to use them properly or willing to put in the effort to learn, I think you can certainly call a calcium reactor ULM because there's no salinity issues, reduced trace element concerns, and overall has the potential to run stably for long periods of time without touching it or general maintenance like replacing media. Okay, before we select the right option for our tanks, what did the community have to say? Starting with Flag 37, for calcium and alkalinity dosing, my opinion would be to use Kalkwasser in the softy tank with its presumably low consumption, dose 2-part on the LPS tank, maybe even the Triton method, and calcium reactor on the SPS tank. It could potentially go over a year without touching it once it's set up and dialed in. I have to agree that the calcium reactor seems like a more viable option than you might think, particularly when you consider the presumed addition of trace elements and no impact on salinity. Our Tea Party had a pretty lengthy post, but thought for the softy tank, once-a-month water changes or daily small changes with an automatic water change should do the trick. For an LPS tank, really any of the solutions would work fine on a ULM. And for an SPS tank, he also surprisingly said a calcium reactor may be the easiest and most straightforward setup here. I think a calcium reactor theme is starting to develop here. However, over on YouTube, Seth Williamson shared, "I've always been a fan of calc. That said, I don't like any of the commercial calc reactors on the market. My biggest complaint on the commercial models is the MTBF of the motors, even when put on a timer." I agree completely. Calc is all too often overlooked, and it's actually one of the best options for individual applications and installs. And you are right, the motors on the calcsters are not the best. That's just a function of it not really being a continuous duty pump, and many people run them that way. But even if they're on timers, they're on for partial but many hours a day, they'll likely still be the case. I think that you need to consider a pump as a consumable component that will wear out and need to be replaced every year or two. Okay, so what do we select for each tank? I'm going to tell you this is one of the hardest decisions of all the episodes to date, and I understand why this stuff is debated so heavily. For the softy tank, it really came down to two options. Use a Neptune dose for 3% automated water changes with a 60-gallon storage bin in the other room. This can be done by running protected RO line in the walls, ceiling, or in decorative tracks along the baseboard. An auto water change solution like this on a low demand tank would almost certainly mean all the levels would stay pretty close to parameters of the freshly mixed salt bucket. In addition to that, it would also likely manage not just the nutrient export as well, but also general contaminant reduction of almost every kind. I may even be able to pull the refugium from this tank. The only maintenance that needs to be done is every month I need to mix up 60 gallons of salt water, which I think I can do in just a few minutes. So while I said I hate water changes, this is a pretty attractive option because water changes really only means a 5-minute job mixing salt a dozen times a year. The second option is just dosing a tiny bit of 2-part every day or every week for that matter. But since I would use automated doses, it would likely be daily. This, of course, is super easy as well. Again, it feels like one of the hardest decisions I've made in ages, particularly because I really want to be done mixing salt water. But at the end of the day, it comes down to which is easier, mixing 60 gallons of new salt water a month or managing the daily dose of 2-part and related testing. Since the 3% water changes will not just manage calcium and alkalinity in this low demand tank, but trace elements as well as elevated nutrients and even build up of virtually any undesirable contaminants, I feel compelled to go with the automated water change method as truly the most ULM method of maintaining a polyp and softy tank, so that's what we went with. In conjunction with the Neptune dose, which will perform the water changes for me, I'm going to set up an FMM Neptune level sensor to remind me when the container is approaching empty and new salt water needs to be made each month. Because it's just slightly higher than where I would normally maintain my levels, I'm going to go with the HW Marine mix for the salt mix. Related to that, I gotta tell you, with the 3% water changes, I don't think the refugium we installed is necessary on this tank, and I'm gonna at least temporarily remove the Kato and refugium lamp from this tank. Since we're already not running a skimmer, the sump is now really just a way to increase water volume, hide heaters, place filtration media like carbon in future upgrades. I don't think it will be needed, but we can always add the fuge back in the future if needed. The LPS tank was much easier because the solution of Kalkwasser is so obvious, no salinity issues, benefit of elevated pH, and super simple. In this case, we're just going to use a calc stirrer. Just as a refresher, we have our RDI system hooked up directly to a trigger container here at the tank, so there's always a container of fresh water for our 3 ATOs. We're going to use a Neptune dose to pull from the freshwater container here and pump through the calc stirrer into our tank. The dose, because it's accurate, lasts a long time. Dosing pumps don't siphon, and because it's adjustable to fit the flow speeds and times I want. We're going to go with a calc stirrer because it can keep the calc fully saturated, or at least very close at all times, specifically with the slower flow rates the dose is capable of. When selecting a calc stirrer, I personally suggest getting the largest one that fits for 2 reasons. A larger one can reduce the amount of time between refills, but mostly because it gives you a larger volume of water and longer on-time cycles before the slurry hits the top. We never want to dose that slurry to the tank, just a relatively clear saturated calc solution. During the off cycles, the slurry will drop back down and settle out. In this case, I'm going to go with the Avast Marine. While the Reef Octopus says the motor is good for 1,500 hours, the Avast Marine comes with a motor they claim can be used 24/7. That said, I wouldn't be surprised if we need to replace the motor from time to time. In addition, it's the only calc reactor we stock which has a port for a pH probe. pH isn't the best indicator out there for calc potency, but it is a window into when you need to change the media out. In conjunction with the calc, we're going to calculate the calcium consumption of the tank based on how much saturated calc solution we dose, and then use that information to also dose Red Sea's trace colors to replace the trace elements. Coupled with monthly Triton ICP tests, we can share how well this approach works. All in all, I think this has to be the lowest maintenance option out there, and I think the only maintenance will be periodically adding some calc to the reactor and cleaning it. I also like the approach of using controlled doses of fully saturated calc better than relying on evaporation, ATOs, and varied potencies. And on to what will be the highest demand tank. This will be a 2-phase process. First, we're going to go with the exact same setup as the LPS tank. I think reefers just don't give Kalkwasser credit for how well it maintains calcium and alkalinity, and often referred to as a lower to medium demand solution. We're going to take it as far as it will go so you can see exactly what type of SPS tank can be sustained with dosing Kalkwasser alone. As soon as the demand is higher than can be supplied with the calc alone, we're going to swap out for a calcium reactor. To be honest, I'd like to go with the calcium reactor from day one, just because I really want to explore the trace element component in a minimal water change environment. But I think setting up a reactor for very low demand in the first 6 months to a year will be a challenge. I would rather add a calcium reactor when the tank is in a bit more robust stage. End of the day, I think this is a solid opportunity to explore how little work a calcium reactor can be if it's installed correctly with the right equipment and the easiest approach to tuning is applied. I think as reefers apply everything that we've learned in the last decade, explore modern reef keeping approaches, especially those that don't rely heavily on water changes, I think we're going to see calcium reactors become much more popular. I can't wait to hear what everyone thinks of our ultimate approach here. Do you agree? Things you would have done different? Next week, we're talking ULM fish and cleanup crew, so don't be shy what you think are the best options for bare-bottom tanks designed to be ultra-low maintenance. In the meantime, don't forget we're giving away a $500 gift card this week, which is huge, so hit that link in the lower left-hand corner or head on over to the site, click specials and deals, and then free stuff to sign up. As always, if you like what we're doing here, give us a quick thumbs up and hit that subscribe button because we release new reefing videos all week long. See you next week with another episode of BRStv Tank Trials ULM Edition.